Hashtag their SOS was ignored, until one precise shot echoed the morning of March 15th, 2019, started like any other day for Captain Maria Santos aboard the cargo vessel Northern Star. She had been sailing these Pacific shipping routes for 12 years, and the waters between Los Angeles and Manila were as familiar to her as the streets of her hometown in the Philippines. The 180-meter container ship carried a crew of 23, mostly Filipino seamen who had worked together for years, building the kind of trust that only comes from facing storms and calm seas together. Maria stood on the bridge, watching the sunrise paint the ocean in shades of gold and orange. The weather reports showed clear skies for the next 48 hours, and they were making excellent time toward their destination. The ship's manifest included electronics, machinery parts, and medical supplies bound for hospitals in Southeast Asia. It was routine cargo on a routine voyage, exactly the kind of peaceful trip that veteran sailors appreciate after years of battling rough weather and equipment failures. Chief Engineer Roberto "Bobby" Dela Cruz was 3 decks below, conducting his morning inspection of the engine room. At 55, Bobby had spent more than half his life maintaining ship engines, and he could diagnose problems by sound alone. The massive diesel engines were running smoothly, their steady rhythm creating a comforting vibration throughout the ship's hull. Everything appeared normal as he checked gauges, oil levels, and cooling systems. In the galley, Cook Emmanuel Pascual was preparing breakfast for the crew. The smell of rice, fried fish, and coffee drifted through the corridors, bringing sailors from their quarters to begin another day at sea. The mood was relaxed and cheerful. Several crew members discussed plans for their shore leave in Manila, while others shared photos of their families back home. First Officer Carlos Mendoza reviewed the navigation charts on the bridge with Maria. They were approximately 800 nautical miles southwest of Los Angeles, traveling through international waters that saw moderate shipping traffic. The nearest land was a small, uninhabited island chain about 200 miles to the north, while the closest major port was still days away. Their current position put them in one of the more isolated stretches of the Pacific, but the ship's communication equipment was functioning perfectly, maintaining regular contact with maritime authorities. Around 10:30 a.m., Bobby noticed something unusual in the engine room. A slight vibration that hadn't been there during his morning inspection was now present in the main propulsion shaft. It was barely perceptible, but his experienced hands felt the change immediately when he touched the housing. He made a note to monitor the situation closely and increase the frequency of his inspections. The crew went about their regular duties throughout the morning. Deckhands secured cargo containers that had shifted slightly during the night, while the communications officer maintained radio contact with other vessels in the area. The ship's automated systems showed all green lights across the board, from navigation equipment to safety systems. At noon, Maria received a routine weather update that showed a small low-pressure system developing about 500 miles to the southeast. The meteorologist's report indicated it was moving slowly and posed no immediate threat to their route. She made a note in the ship's log and continued monitoring the situation, but felt no cause for concern. Bobby's afternoon inspection revealed that the vibration in the propulsion shaft had increased slightly. More concerning was a small, but noticeable temperature rise in one of the main bearings. He immediately called Maria to report his findings, and they agreed to reduce speed by 2 knots as a precautionary measure while Bobby investigated further. The engineering team spent several hours examining the propulsion system, checking oil pressure, alignment, and bearing temperatures. They discovered that one of the main shaft bearings was showing signs of premature wear, likely caused by a manufacturing defect that was only now becoming apparent after months of operation. The bearing was still functional, but it would require careful monitoring and eventual replacement at their next major port. As evening approached, the weather began to change. The low-pressure system mentioned in the morning report had intensified more quickly than predicted and was moving in their direction. Wind speeds increased from light breezes to moderate gusts, and the sea state grew from calm to choppy. Maria altered course slightly to avoid the worst of the weather, but she wasn't particularly concerned. The Northern Star was built to handle much worse conditions. Around 8 p.m., Bobby discovered oil in the bilge near the main engine. The amount wasn't large, but it indicated that the bearing problem was worsening. Oil was leaking from the housing around the damaged bearing, and the temperature readings continued to climb. He reduced engine power further and began preparations for a more detailed inspection that would require shutting down the main engine temporarily. The weather continued to deteriorate throughout the evening. What had started as a minor low-pressure system was now showing characteristics of a developing storm. Wind speeds reached 35 knots, and wave heights increased to 12 feet. The ship began to roll and pitch more dramatically, making movement around the decks challenging for the crew. Maria convened a meeting with her senior officers to discuss their options. The bearing problem was becoming more serious, and the worsening weather was adding complications. They could continue at reduced speed and hope to reach Manila before the bearing failed completely, or they could seek shelter and attempt repairs. The nearest port with adequate repair facilities was still more than 1,000 miles away. The decision became more urgent when Bobby reported that the bearing temperature had reached critical levels. Continuing to run the engine at any speed risked catastrophic failure that could leave them completely dead in the water. Maria ordered the main engine shut down so Bobby and his team could attempt emergency repairs. With the main engines offline, the Northern Star lost propulsion and began drifting in the increasingly rough seas. The ship's auxiliary generators continued to provide power for lights, communications, and essential systems, but they were now at the mercy of wind and waves. Maria immediately contacted the Coast Guard and maritime authorities to report their situation and request assistance. The emergency repair attempt revealed the full extent of the problem. The main bearing had suffered severe damage, with metal fragments contaminating the oil system. The bearing housing itself was cracked, making a permanent repair impossible with the equipment and materials available on board. Bobby estimated they could implement a temporary fix that might allow limited engine operation, but it would take at least 12 hours to complete and would require calm seas. Unfortunately, the weather showed no signs of improving. The storm continued to intensify, with wind speeds now exceeding 45 knots and wave heights reaching 18 feet. The ship rolled heavily in the confused seas, making any detailed mechanical work extremely dangerous. Tools and parts slid across the engine room deck, and the crew struggled to maintain their footing. Maria sent out their first official distress call at 11:47 p.m., using both radio and satellite communications to alert maritime authorities to their situation. She provided their exact coordinates, described the mechanical failure and weather conditions, and requested information about nearby vessels that might be able to provide assistance. The response was professional and reassuring, with authorities acknowledging their distress call and beginning coordination efforts for rescue operations. The Coast Guard informed Maria that the nearest rescue vessel was a cutter based in San Diego, but it would take at least 18 hours to reach their position in the current weather conditions. Several commercial vessels in the general area were also notified and asked to alter course to provide assistance if possible. However, the storm was affecting a large area, and other ships were also seeking shelter or detouring around the worst weather. Throughout the night, Bobby and his engineering team worked in shifts to attempt the bearing repair. The rolling motion of the ship made precision work nearly impossible, and they suffered several minor injuries from sliding equipment and tools. Progress was slow and frustrating, with each major roll of the ship undoing careful adjustments they had made to the damaged bearing assembly. The weather forecast brought no good news. The storm was now classified as a significant weather event, with sustained winds expected to reach 55 knots and wave heights potentially exceeding 25 feet. The system was moving slowly, meaning they would be trapped in dangerous conditions for at least another 24 hours before seeing any improvement. By dawn on March 16th, the situation had become critical. The temporary bearing repair had failed during the night when a particularly violent roll of the ship caused additional damage to the already weakened bearing housing. Oil was now leaking more rapidly, and any attempt to start the main engines would likely result in complete destruction of the propulsion system. Maria faced a difficult decision. They could continue drifting and hope for rescue, but their position was carrying them toward a reef system that appeared on charts as a navigation hazard. The combination of strong winds and ocean currents was pushing them steadily towards shallow water and rocky outcroppings that could destroy the ship if they were driven aground. The crew's morale remained surprisingly high despite the worsening situation. These were experienced sailors who had faced storms and equipment failures before, and they trusted in their captain's leadership and the Coast Guard's rescue capabilities. However, the younger crew members were beginning to show signs of stress as the reality of their situation became apparent. Communications with the Coast Guard revealed that the rescue cutter was making slower progress than hoped due to the severe weather. Other commercial vessels in the area were reporting similar difficulties with the storm conditions, and 2 cargo ships had already declared emergencies of their own related to weather damage. The Maritime Rescue Coordination Center was managing multiple situations simultaneously, stretching available resources thin. Around midday, the ship's position had drifted to within 30 miles of the reef system. The dangerous rocks were still invisible below the horizon, but electronic charts showed shallow water and navigation hazards that would be fatal to a ship the size of the Northern Star. Wind and current were continuing to push them steadily in that direction, and without propulsion, they had no way to alter their course. Maria made the decision to deploy the ship's sea anchor, a large parachute-like device designed to slow their drift and help maintain some control over their position. The deployment was dangerous in the current sea conditions, requiring several crew members to work on the exposed deck with safety lines while waves crashed over the bow. After an hour of careful work, they successfully deployed the sea anchor, which immediately reduced their drift rate and helped stabilize the ship's motion. The afternoon brought a brief improvement in weather conditions, with wind speeds dropping to 40 knots and wave heights decreasing slightly. Bobby saw this as an opportunity to attempt one final repair effort on the main bearing. With improved working conditions in the engine room, his team made better progress on the temporary fix, managing to install a makeshift bearing sleeve and seal the oil leak. However, when they attempted to start the main engines, the vibration was so severe that Maria ordered them shut down immediately. The temporary repair had failed to address the fundamental problem, and running the engines would likely cause catastrophic damage to other components of the propulsion system. They were still completely without power and continuing to drift toward the reef. As evening approached, their situation became desperate. Despite the deployed sea anchor, they had drifted to within 20 miles of the reef system. The Coast Guard cutter was still hours away, fighting heavy seas and making minimal progress toward their position. Other potential rescue vessels were even further away or dealing with their own weather-related emergencies. The crew gathered for an emergency meeting where Maria explained their situation honestly. They were running out of time before drifting into the reef system, where the ship would likely be destroyed and lives would be lost. The lifeboats could be deployed, but launching them in current sea conditions would be extremely dangerous, and their chances of survival in the open ocean during a storm were questionable. One crew member suggested using the ship's emergency flares to signal their distress, but they were still too far from land or shipping lanes for visual signals to be effective. Another suggested attempting to jury-rig a sail using cargo tarps, but the ship's size and design made this impractical in the current wind conditions. As night fell on their second day adrift, the mood aboard the Northern Star grew somber. They had done everything possible to save their ship and themselves, but they were running out of options. The reef system was now clearly visible on radar, showing as an ominous line of shallow water and rocks stretching across their path like a wall. Maria spent the evening sending detailed reports to maritime authorities, providing updates on their position, condition, and the timeline for reaching the reef system. She also began preparing the crew for the possibility of abandoning ship, reviewing lifeboat procedures, and survival equipment. The professional calm she maintained helped keep the crew focused, but everyone understood the gravity of their situation. The night passed slowly, with crew members taking turns on watch and monitoring their position. The sea anchor was holding, but they continued to drift steadily toward danger. By morning, they would be close enough to the reef to see individual rocks and breaking waves, assuming they survived the night in the increasingly violent storm conditions. Bobby made one final attempt to restore partial engine power, working through the night with his most experienced engineers. They bypassed several safety systems and implemented desperate measures that would normally never be considered, but nothing they tried could overcome the fundamental damage to the main bearing system. The engines remained completely inoperable. As the sun rose on what might be their final day, Maria stood on the bridge watching the reef system grow larger on the horizon. The breaking waves over the rocks were clearly visible now, creating a line of white foam that stretched for miles. Behind her, the crew prepared the lifeboats and reviewed emergency procedures one final time. Their SOS calls continued to go out over radio and satellite systems, but rescue still seemed impossibly far away. The morning of March 17th brought no relief from the storm, but it did bring a terrifying clarity to their situation. The reef system now dominated the southern horizon, with white water clearly visible as massive waves crashed against the rocky barriers. Captain Maria Santos estimated they had less than 6 hours before the Northern Star would be driven into the shallow water and destroyed. The Coast Guard cutter Steadfast was still struggling through heavy seas, now estimated to be 8 hours away from their position. Radio communications with the rescue vessel revealed that they were fighting 30-foot seas and had suffered minor damage to their own equipment while pushing through the storm. Every mile toward the Northern Star was hard-fought against wind and waves that seemed determined to prevent any rescue attempt. Maria called her senior officers together for what might be their final strategy meeting. The ship's exact position put them on a collision course with the largest section of the reef system, where jagged volcanic rocks rose from depths of over 200 feet to just below the surface. The charts showed no gaps wide enough for a ship their size, and the violent surf would make survival impossible for anyone thrown into the water. Chief Engineer Bobby Dela Cruz reported that his team had exhausted every possible repair option. The main bearing was completely destroyed, and attempting to run the engines now would likely cause an explosion in the engine room. The auxiliary power systems were still functioning, providing electricity for lights, communications, and pumps, but they had no means of propulsion or steering control. First Officer Carlos Mendoza had been monitoring radio traffic and reported some disturbing news. 2 other vessels in the area had declared emergencies related to the storm, and a fishing boat with 6 crew members was reported missing about 100 miles to the east. The Coast Guard and maritime authorities were coordinating multiple rescue operations simultaneously, stretching their resources beyond normal capacity. The crew's families have been notified of their situation through maritime communication channels. Messages of support and prayers were coming in from around the world as news of their predicament spread through the tight-knit community of Filipino sailors. The emotional weight of potentially never seeing their loved ones again was beginning to affect even the most experienced crew members. Around 10 a.m., a new voice joined the radio communications. Captain James Mitchell of the bulk carrier Pacific Dawn reported that his vessel was approximately 60 miles northeast of their position and was attempting to reach them. The Pacific Dawn was a larger ship with more powerful engines and was making better progress through the storm than the Coast Guard cutter. Captain Mitchell estimated he could reach the Northern Star within 4 hours. This news brought renewed hope to the crew, but also highlighted the desperate timeline they were facing. Even if the Pacific Dawn reached them in 4 hours, they would be dangerously close to the reef system, making any rescue operation extremely hazardous. The bulk carrier would also be fighting the same wind and current that was driving the Northern Star toward destruction. Maria began preparing for multiple scenarios. If the Pacific Dawn could reach them in time, they would need to coordinate a ship-to-ship transfer of personnel in extremely dangerous conditions. If rescue was impossible, they would have to abandon ship and hope to survive in life rafts until help arrived. Neither option offered good odds of survival for all 23 crew members. The weather forecast offered no encouragement. The storm was maintaining its intensity and was expected to continue for at least another 24 hours. Wind speeds were steady at 50 knots with gusts to 65 knots, and wave heights were consistently over 25 feet. These were borderline survival conditions, even for a fully functional ship with experienced crew. Bobby and his engineering team made a desperate decision to attempt something that violated every safety protocol they knew. They would try to restart just one of the main engines, accepting the certainty of catastrophic damage in hopes of generating enough thrust to alter their course away from the reef. It was essentially a suicide mission for the ship's engine, but it might buy them enough time for rescue to arrive. The attempt to restart the engines required bypassing numerous safety systems and accepting oil pressure readings that were far below safe operating levels. Bobby knew that running the damaged bearing would likely destroy the engine within minutes, but even a few minutes of thrust might be enough to change their trajectory and avoid the most dangerous section of reef. At 11:30 a.m., with the reef system clearly visible and growing larger by the hour, Bobby attempted to start the starboard main engine. The initial startup sequence seemed normal, but as soon as the engine reached operating speed, violent vibrations shook the entire ship. Metal grinding sounds echoed through the engine room, and alarms began sounding as oil pressure dropped to critical levels. Maria felt the engine vibrations on the bridge and knew immediately what Bobby was attempting. The ship began to move forward for the first time in nearly 2 days, but the engine noise was clearly indicating catastrophic damage. She ordered Bobby to maintain power for as long as possible while she attempted to steer away from the reef. The ship's movement through the water was sluggish and erratic due to the damaged propulsion system, but it was movement nonetheless. Maria managed to alter their course by approximately 15 degrees, which would carry them past the largest concentration of rocks. However, the engine lasted only 8 minutes before Bobby was forced to shut it down as the bearing housing finally disintegrated completely. The brief period of engine power had bought them perhaps 2 hours of additional time before reaching the reef, but it had also completely destroyed their last hope of restoring propulsion. The starboard engine was now beyond any possibility of repair, with metal fragments scattered throughout the oil system and the propeller shaft no longer connected to the drivetrain. Radio contact with the Pacific Dawn brought mixed news. Captain Mitchell reported that he was making better progress than expected and might reach them within 3 hours. However, his ship was also taking a beating from the storm, with cargo containers breaking loose on deck and minor flooding in several compartments. The rescue operation would be extremely dangerous for both vessels. The crew began preparing for evacuation in earnest. Life jackets were distributed and checked. Emergency supplies were loaded into waterproof containers, and the ship's life rafts were readied for deployment. The process was complicated by the ship's violent motion in the heavy seas, and several crew members suffered minor injuries from falling equipment and sliding cargo. Around 1 p.m., a new complication arose. The ship's position had carried them close enough to the reef for the depth sounder to detect the bottom. They were still in deep water, but the irregular readings showed underwater peaks and valleys that indicated the complex structure of the coral and volcanic rock system. Some areas showed depths of less than 50 feet, which would be fatal for a ship with a draft of over 25 feet. The visual sight of the reef was becoming terrifying. Individual rocks were now visible above the surface during the wave troughs, and the sound of crashing surf could be heard even over the storm winds. The water color had changed from deep blue to the lighter shades that indicated shallow areas ahead. White foam marked the location of submerged rocks where waves were breaking. Maria made the difficult decision to begin launching life rafts while they were still in relatively deep water. Waiting until they were closer to rescue would also mean being closer to the reef, where the violent surf would make survival impossible. She ordered the crew to begin abandoning ship in an organized sequence, starting with the least experienced sailors who would need more time to get safely away from the vessel. The first life raft deployment nearly ended in disaster. The inflation mechanism worked correctly, but the raft was immediately swept against the ship's hull by wind and waves. 2 crew members were already in the water when the raft capsized, throwing them into the churning seas. Quick action by other crew members with safety lines managed to pull them back aboard the ship, but the incident demonstrated the extreme danger of abandoning ship in current conditions. A second life raft was successfully launched from the opposite side of the ship, where the hull provided some protection from the worst wind. 6 crew members managed to board the raft and get clear of the Northern Star, but maintaining position near the ship required constant effort with emergency paddles. The small raft was being tossed around like a toy in the massive waves. At 2:30 p.m., the Pacific Dawn finally appeared on the horizon. Captain Mitchell's ship was clearly visible despite the storm, and radio contact confirmed they were approaching at maximum safe speed. However, the rescue ship was still more than an hour away, and the Northern Star was now less than 5 miles from the reef system. The sight of the approaching rescue vessel energized the crew and gave them renewed hope, but it also highlighted how little time remained. The bulk carrier would have to coordinate a rescue operation in extremely dangerous conditions, with both ships fighting the storm and the reef system threatening to destroy anyone who came too close. Bobby made a final inspection of the engine room and reported that water was beginning to enter through stress fractures in the hull. The violent motion in the heavy seas was causing structural damage, and the ship was slowly taking on water in addition to their other problems. The bilge pumps were handling the influx for now, but the situation was deteriorating steadily. Maria ordered the remaining crew to prepare for immediate evacuation. The second life raft had proven that escape was possible, but extremely dangerous. She planned to launch all remaining life rafts simultaneously and coordinate with the Pacific Dawn to pick up survivors as quickly as possible. Every minute of delay increased the risk for everyone involved. The Pacific Dawn approached to within half a mile before Captain Mitchell determined it was too dangerous to come closer. The proximity to the reef system and the violent sea conditions made a close approach impossible without risking both vessels. Instead, he positioned his ship upwind of the Northern Star and prepared to deploy his own rescue boats to collect survivors from the life rafts. The rescue operation began at 3:45 p.m. with the launch of 3 life rafts in rapid succession. 17 remaining crew members divided among the rafts, with Maria insisting on being the last person to leave her ship. The raft deployments were successful, but maintaining control of the small craft in the storm conditions required superhuman effort from the occupants. Captain Mitchell deployed 2 of his ship's emergency boats to collect the life rafts. The rescue boats were larger and more seaworthy than life rafts, but they were still small craft in massive seas. The boat crews were volunteers from the Pacific Dawn who risked their own lives to save the crew of the Northern Star. The first rescue boat reached the life rafts at 4:15 p.m. and began the dangerous process of transferring survivors from the rafts to the boat. The operation required precise timing and coordination, with transfers taking place during brief moments when the boats were close together on wave crests. Several crew members were pulled from the water after falling during the transfer process. Maria watched from her ship's bridge as her crew was gradually evacuated to safety. The Northern Star was now close enough to the reef that individual rocks were clearly visible, and the sound of surf was growing louder. She estimated less than 30 minutes before her ship would strike the reef and be destroyed. The second rescue boat encountered problems when its engine failed during the recovery operation. The small craft began drifting toward the reef with 5 rescued sailors aboard, creating a new emergency within the ongoing crisis. The boat crew managed to restart their engine after several terrifying minutes, but the incident highlighted how close everyone was to disaster. At 4:40 p.m., the final rescue boat reached the Northern Star to collect Maria. She took one last look around the bridge that had been her workplace and responsibility for the past 3 days. The ship that had been her command and her crew's livelihood was about to be destroyed, but everyone would survive because of the courage and skill of the rescue crews. The transfer from ship to rescue boat was the most dangerous part of the entire operation. The rescue boat could not come alongside the much larger cargo vessel safely, so Maria had to climb down a rope ladder and time her jump into the boat during a brief moment when the vessels were close together. She made the jump successfully, but injured her shoulder in the impact. As the rescue boats made their way back to the Pacific Dawn, Maria and her crew watched the Northern Star continue its drift toward destruction. The ship that had been their workplace and their responsibility was now an unmanned vessel heading for certain destruction on the reef system that had threatened them for the past 2 days. The Northern Star struck the outer edge of the reef at 5:23 p.m. with a grinding sound that could be heard over the storm winds. The ship's hull was torn open by the volcanic rocks, and she began settling immediately as thousands of gallons of seawater rushed in her engine room and cargo holds. The sight was heartbreaking for the crew who had spent years working aboard her. Within an hour, the Northern Star had broken apart completely on the reef. The storm waves pounded the wreckage against the rocks until nothing remained visible above the surface except scattered debris and cargo containers. The ship and her cargo were completely lost, but all 23 crew members had survived thanks to the heroic efforts of the Pacific Dawn and her crew. The rescued sailors were brought aboard the bulk carrier, where they received medical attention and warm clothing. Captain Mitchell and his crew had risked their own lives to save strangers in distress, continuing the maritime tradition that sailors help other sailors regardless of nationality or circumstance. As night fell and the storm began to moderate slightly, Maria stood on the deck of the Pacific Dawn watching the lights of wreckage floating on the waves. Her ship was gone, but her crew was alive. The SOS calls that it seemed to go unheard had ultimately brought rescue, though it had taken courage and precision from many people to make salvation possible. The deck of the Pacific Dawn became a temporary refuge for 23 souls who had escaped death by the narrowest of margins. Captain Maria Santos and her crew found themselves wrapped in emergency blankets, drinking hot coffee, and trying to process the reality that they were alive when their ship lay shattered on the reef behind them. The bulk carrier's crew had prepared makeshift sleeping areas and medical facilities to accommodate the unexpected passengers. Dr. Sarah Chun, the Pacific Dawn's medical officer, worked through the night treating injuries sustained during the rescue operation. Most were minor cuts and bruises from the violent transfer between vessels, but 3 crew members required more serious attention. Chief Engineer Bobby Dela Cruz had suffered a deep laceration on his arm from sharp metal during the final engine repair attempt, and 2 sailors had hypothermia from their time in the water when the first life raft capsized. Captain James Mitchell of the Pacific Dawn proved to be not only a skilled mariner, but also a compassionate host to the displaced crew. His own vessel had sustained damage during the rescue operation, including bent railings, broken windows, and flooded compartment from the massive waves encountered while maneuvering close to the reef. Despite these problems threatening his own ship and schedule, he had never hesitated to risk everything for strangers in distress. As dawn broke on March 18th, the full extent of the Northern Star's destruction became visible. The reef system that had threatened them for 3 days now held the scattered remains of the cargo vessel. Containers bobbed in the surf, their contents spilling into the ocean. Parts of the ship's superstructure were wedged between rocks, being pounded to pieces by the relentless waves that had finally calmed to a manageable level. The storm that had trapped them was finally weakening, but it had left behind a scene of devastation that extended far beyond their own tragedy. Coast Guard aircraft conducting search and rescue operations reported debris fields from multiple vessels, oil slicks from damaged ships, and emergency beacons from life rafts scattered across hundreds of square miles of ocean. Maria spent the morning in radio communication with maritime authorities, providing detailed reports about the loss of her vessel and the condition of her crew. The investigation into the incident would be thorough and lengthy, examining everything from the bearing failure that started their problems to the weather forecasting that had underestimated the storm's intensity. The crew of the Northern Star gradually began to emerge from the shock of their ordeal and started thinking about practical concerns. Most had lost everything except the clothes they wore during the evacuation. Personal belongings, important documents, family photographs, and months of earned wages were all resting on the ocean floor with their destroyed ship. Bobby Dela Cruz was particularly devastated by the loss of his engineering manuals and tools. He had spent decades collecting technical references and precision instruments that were essential to his profession. The specialized equipment was irreplaceable and represented not just monetary value, but years of accumulated knowledge and experience. Cook Emmanuel Pascual mourned the loss of his kitchen and the recipes he had developed during years of feeding hungry crews. His galley had been his domain and his pride, equipped with equipment and ingredients carefully selected to provide good meals under challenging conditions. The thought of starting over with nothing felt overwhelming. Captain Mitchell made arrangements to divert the Pacific Dawn to the nearest major port where the rescued crew could receive proper assistance. This meant a significant delay and expense for his own cargo delivery, but maritime law and tradition demanded that rescued persons be brought to safety as quickly as possible. The Filipino consul in Los Angeles was notified of the crew's situation and began coordinating assistance for their eventual repatriation. Since most crew members had lost their identification documents with the ship, replacement papers would need to be issued before they could travel. The process could take weeks or even months to complete. News of the rescue spread quickly through the maritime community and beyond. Television news crews were waiting at the port when the Pacific Dawn arrived, eager to interview the survivors of what was being called a miracle rescue. The story of the precise timing and courage required to save all hands captured public imagination worldwide. Maria found herself uncomfortable with the media attention that followed their rescue. She preferred to focus on the facts of what happened rather than dramatic interpretations of their survival. As a professional mariner, she understood that their situation had been the result of equipment failure and weather conditions, not some mysterious intervention. However, the story that emerged in news reports emphasized the seemingly impossible precision required for their rescue. The Pacific Dawn had arrived with less than an hour to spare before the Northern Star was destroyed on the reef. The rescue operation itself had required split-second timing and extraordinary seamanship from both crews. The Coast Guard cutter Steadfast finally reached the wreck site 12 hours after the rescue was completed. Her crew documented the destruction and began environmental assessment of the oil and cargo spills from the sunken vessel. The sight of the completely destroyed ship confirmed how close all 23 crew members had come to certain death. Investigation into the bearing failure that caused their initial problems revealed a manufacturing defect in the main shaft bearing. The component had been installed during routine maintenance 6 months earlier and had gradually deteriorated under normal operating conditions. The failure was not due to any negligence by the crew or shipping company. The weather data analysis showed that the storm had intensified much more rapidly than predicted by current forecasting models. The low-pressure system had drawn energy from unusually warm ocean temperatures and had developed characteristics normally associated with tropical cyclones. Climate change was identified as a likely contributing factor to the extreme weather. Bobby's detailed engineering report became a case study for maritime safety organizations worldwide. His documentation of the bearing failure and the impossible repair attempts provided valuable information for improving bearing design and emergency procedures. The report was translated into multiple languages and distributed to engineering schools globally. The crew of the Northern Star remained together on the Pacific Dawn for 5 days while traveling to Los Angeles. During this time, they formed close friendships with their rescuers and learned about the courage required to risk one's life for strangers. Captain Mitchell's crew had volunteered for the rescue operation, knowing they might not survive the attempt. The rescue boat crews who had actually transferred the survivors from the life rafts were honored by maritime organizations for their extraordinary bravery. Operating small boats in 25-foot seas near a reef system required skills and courage that few people possess. Their precise execution of the rescue had made the difference between life and death for 23 people. When the Pacific Dawn finally docked in Los Angeles, the rescued crew faced an uncertain future. Most had been employed by the shipping company for years, but the loss of the vessel meant unemployment for all hands. The company's insurance would eventually provide compensation, but the process would take months to resolve. Maria was offered command of another vessel within weeks of the incident, but she declined pending completion of the investigation. As the captain, she felt responsible for the loss of her ship, even though the bearing failure had been beyond anyone's control. The weight of command includes accepting responsibility for everything that happens, even unforeseeable equipment failures. The psychological impact of their near-death experience affected different crew members in different ways. Some suffered nightmares and anxiety about returning to sea, while others seemed energized by their survival and eager to continue their maritime careers. Professional counseling was provided to help them process the trauma of their ordeal. Bobby eventually returned to sea after 6 months of unemployment and recovery from his injuries. His experience with the bearing failure made him even more valuable as a chief engineer, and he was recruited by multiple shipping companies. However, he never forgot the sound of metal grinding apart as their last hope of propulsion destroyed itself. The precise shot mentioned in the story's title became maritime legend, referring to Captain Mitchell's exact navigation that brought the Pacific Dawn to their position with just enough time for rescue. The timing had required precise calculation of wind, current, and sea conditions over a 60-mile approach in a massive storm. Investigation revealed that Captain Mitchell had pushed his engines beyond safe operating limits to reach the Northern Star in time. He had risked his own ship and crew to save strangers, accepting damage to his vessel and cargo delays that cost his company hundreds of thousands of dollars. His actions exemplified the highest traditions of seamanship. The environmental impact of a Northern Star's destruction took months to assess and years to remediate. The cargo included electronics containing toxic materials, and the ship's fuel oil created slicks that threatened marine life throughout the region. Cleanup costs exceeded the value of the ship and cargo combined. The reef system where the ship was destroyed became a protected area to prevent salvage operations that might cause additional environmental damage. The wreckage was left in place after removing the most toxic materials, and it gradually became an artificial reef supporting marine life. 1 year after the incident, the crew of the Northern Star held a reunion aboard a chartered vessel near the site of their rescue. They placed a memorial wreath on the water above their sunken ship and honored the courage of the Pacific Dawn's crew who had saved their lives. The ceremony provided closure for their shared trauma. Maria eventually accepted command of a new vessel, but she never forgot the lessons learned during those 3 days in March 2019. The importance of preparation, the value of experienced crews, and the power of precise action under pressure became central themes in her leadership style. She implemented new safety procedures based on their experience. The maritime industry made several changes as a result of the Northern Star incident. Bearing inspection procedures were revised, weather forecasting was improved, and emergency response protocols were updated. The precise documentation provided by Maria and Bobby helped identify systemic improvements that would prevent similar tragedies. Captain Mitchell was honored by multiple maritime organizations and received the highest civilian recognition for life-saving from several governments. However, he consistently deflected praise to his crew members who had actually operated the rescue boats. In his view, he had simply done what any competent mariner would do when fellow sailors were in distress. The story of the Northern Star became required reading in maritime academies worldwide. The combination of equipment failure, extreme weather, and successful rescue provided valuable lessons for future mariners. Students studied the precise timing and decision-making that had made survival possible when everything went wrong simultaneously. Bobby eventually became a maritime safety instructor, teaching emergency repair procedures and bearing maintenance to new generations of engineers. His classes always included the story of the Northern Star as an example of how quickly normal operations can become life-threatening emergencies. His students learned to appreciate the precision required for survival at sea. The friendship between the crews of the two ships continued for years after their rescue. Annual reunions brought together the survivors and their rescuers to celebrate their shared experience and remember how precisely timed courage had made survival possible. The bonds formed during those desperate hours proved stronger than ordinary friendships. Emmanuel returned to cooking for ship's crews, but never again took for granted the simple pleasure of preparing meals in safety. His new galley was equipped with additional emergency supplies and safety equipment, and he trained other cooks in emergency procedures. He understood that precision and preparation could mean the difference between life and death. The weather system that had nearly destroyed them continued eastward, eventually dissipating over the American mainland after causing additional damage to coastal areas. Meteorologists studying the storm concluded that it had been an unusual event that combined multiple factors to create unexpected intensity. The precision required for their rescue had depended on countless individual decisions and actions by people they never met. Weather forecasters, radio operators, Coast Guard coordinators, and maritime traffic controllers had all played essential roles in making rescue possible. Their professional competence had created the conditions for survival. Years later, when Maria was asked about the experience, she always emphasized the teamwork and preparation that had made survival possible. The dramatic rescue had been possible only because of professional competence, careful planning, and precise execution under extreme pressure. Their SOS had been answered by people who understood that precision and courage could overcome seemingly impossible odds. The echo of that precise shot, the exact navigation and timing that brought rescue when hope was nearly gone, continued to inspire maritime professionals worldwide. It proved that when everything goes wrong, precise action by skilled professionals can still make the difference between tragedy and salvation. The Northern Star was gone forever, resting in pieces on a Pacific reef, but her crew survived to tell the story of how their desperate SOS calls had finally been answered by mariners who understood that precision under pressure is the essence of seamanship. Their survival had required split-second timing, extraordinary courage, and the kind of precise action that defines the best of maritime tradition.